Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ash and I'll be the Zoom moderator. Please, we encourage you to use the chat for any comments or questions. And yeah, I'll just pass it right over to our speaker so we can go ahead and get started.
So good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're coming in from the world. Welcome to the camp. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you. So I'm Brun Puentedura, and during this year, I will be working as the innovator in residence as part of the Shaping EDU project at ASU. And in that context, I'm going to be talking about Black Swans, Black Swan thinking, and what to do about Black Swans. So there's going to be more about that project coming out in the coming days, but today what I want to focus on is a little bit of the context for this. In other words, the first thing I want to talk about is not just, okay, let's assume we all know what a Black Swan is and we're going to jump straight into doing something at Black Swans. I'm saying, hold on, what does it take to be able to think effectively about Black Swans? And having thought about Black Swans, well, and being confronted with a Black Swan, what does it take to respond to a Black Swan? So basically, what we're going to be talking about is 3 types of tools that can help us with this. And to see a little bit more why these are necessary, let me put on screen what the definition of a Black Swan is, just so we're starting out from the same ground for everyone. So let me share that screen here for a second. All right. And all of you should now be seeing a slide that says 3 things about Black Swan events, right? You see that Black Swans cannot be predicted ahead of time, have a major effect, and can be rationalized retrospectively. Okay, so those 3 items are pretty crucial to keep in mind. First and foremost, you cannot predict a Black Swan event. In other words, a Black Swan event, by definition, is unpredictable. So if your institution ever gets contacted by a consultant that says, I want to teach you how to predict Black Swan events, that's the point at which you can hang up the phone. You don't know what on earth they're talking about, because you cannot predict a Black Swan event. If it is a Black Swan event, then it cannot be predicted. Otherwise, you've got your definition, maybe something else, might be something else with a big impact, but it isn't a Black Swan event. So this is the first thing. These types of changing the ground rule type events cannot be predicted ahead of time. The second one is that they have a major effect. Okay, so nobody cares about, oh, well, that never happened before, but that's okay because it didn't matter. It impacts huge systems. It impacts whole organizations. It impacts how they do business, why they do business, and how. So that's the second item. And the third one that is crucial to what we're going to be talking about today is that Black Swan events can be rationalized retrospectively. In other words, after the event happens, you can go back and say, oh, that's why that happened. But you couldn't have done this ahead of time. And this third component is the one that points at what I want to talk about today, which is what's the tool set that allows you to do that rationalization, but not just to rationalize, not just to think about how to set the stage for how you think about Black Swans, but also what you do about them. Because I have to be honest with you, one of the things that's happened with COVID-19 is, first, a lot of people are assuming it's a Black Swan event. I'm far from convinced about that. If any of you are curious to hear more about that, if you join the the Shaping EDU community at ASU, you'll find a small paper that I wrote at the beginning of the whole COVID set of events that argues that it's not a Black Swan, it's something closely related. But that's another story. But leaving aside for a second whether COVID-19 is a true Black Swan or not, one of the things I saw was that a lot of people did not see it coming. Okay. But what I was interested to find out is that a lot of people who didn't see it coming had nonetheless participated in scenario work around pandemics prior to COVID-19. And after the COVID-19 events happened, still were unable to respond effectively to it. So what this told me is that sometimes just focusing on the single Black Swan component of how to think about black swans is not enough. It's not enough for what you need to be doing. You need to get some context before and some context afterwards, because clearly these people who had been to the pandemic exercises but not been able to do anything in terms of not predicting, but certainly preparing for an event akin to what they studied, and who weren't able to do anything afterwards, were missing these components. Let me stop sharing here, because this all means that what we have to do is we need to do something in terms of something rather unusual. We need to think about this in terms of tools that work from the past, but also work towards a future. And because we're at camp, all good campers should always have with them a camping book. So I'm going to show you now on camera. I don't know if you can see this. I'm trying to see if you can get it there, but there you go. This is an important book, The Hitchhiker's Guide. Don't panic. All right. And The Hitchhiker's Guide, it has much wisdom in it. But in particular, I want to quote from the second book in the series, from Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And this is what Doug Adams has to say about time travel. It says, one of the major problems encountered in time travel is not that of accidentally becoming your own father or mother. The major problem is quite simply one of grammar. And the main work to consult in this matter is Dr. Dan Streetmentioner's Time Traveler's Handbook of 1001 Transformations. It will tell you, for instance, how to describe something that was about to happen to you in the past before you avoided it by time jumping forward 2 days in order to avoid it, okay? That's the type of thinking, that's what we need to do when we're thinking about black swan events. So this is why we need a toolkit that works in that way. It allows us to talk about what is yet to come and is unpredictable, the black swan, as though we were talking about it from a future position in which it had already happened, but we were somehow ready for it. So these are the topics, these are the shaping devices, if you will, that will help guide our thinking. And I'm going to be asking all of you to get your hands dirty with 3 questions today, as we're going to see. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to some tools for thinking. All right? But before I do that, let me ask you all, since I know now that I think we've got most people already arrived and settled in, just very quickly, if you can type into the chat whether you've done or worked with any form of black swan planning or thinking in the past. So just type into the chat, you know, have you done any work around black swans? Have you planned for black swan events? Okay, so I'm seeing some yeses, see Brian with a yes there. I see some no's, I see never. Okay, I see Toby saying scenario planning. Okay, it's a close friend. Tom says his life is a sequence of black swans. Okay, you must live close to a lot of lakes. Okay, Alex, nothing like a pandemic. I agree that the pandemic is a little bit more spectacular than most other events that we have. Brian, oh, thank you. That's very useful. Brian has just linked to some resources on his website about black swans. Okay, great. So with that in mind, then, let me start out with the trilogy that we're going to be looking at playing with today. As I say, this is a camp. This isn't meant for me to sit you all down and give you a lecture. If you went to a camp where you just got lectures all day, I'm very sorry. You really should have gone to a better camp as a kid. So I want to give you some toys to play with. In fact, this is the sort of toy that, you know, I don't know if you had the camp counselors that ever gave you, said, okay, here's the macaroni, here's the white glue, and here's the cardboard. Why don't you take it all home? And your parents were forced to say, oh, thank you, with a frozen grin across their face. They're so happy that they're going to be cleaning up macaroni for days after. Well, these are a little tidier, but still meant for you to take home and play. So let's think of the trilogy. The trilogy I'm going to be talking about is systems. I'm going to be talking particularly about system dynamics. I'm going to be talking about agents, and I'm going to be talking about networks. Okay, so let's take each of these in turn. Systems. But we all work within institutions. We all work with systems that are connected with each other. And system dynamics is the study of saying, well, how do we go about understanding this? Now, many people have done great work on this. Donella Meadows, for instance, did some amazing work. And you can find many of her writings on the web. You can find the classes that Jay Forrester taught until sadly his passing last year. You can find work done by the systems group, but let's focus on what are systems really all about, right? And here's what you're expecting me to say. Okay, so we're talking about institutions, we're talking about agreements and so on. No, folks, that's way too complicated. If we're going to do Black Swan thinking, we need to start focusing on general picture, big picture. So you know what systems are all about? I'll tell you what systems are all about. Systems are about bathtubs. Okay, there's the point at which people are saying, wait, did I somehow land in the plumbing session by mistake? I didn't realize there would be plumbing lessons required. No, listen, a system at its most basic can be viewed in terms of two key things. It can be viewed in terms of stocks, where things accumulate, like a big bathtub, okay? So a bathtub is a big container for water. A university is a big container for students, okay? A bank is a big container for money. So yeah, there's some differences between banks and universities and bathtubs. I'll grant you, less than I think. But you can view these as stocks where things accumulate. But the other thing is things go in and out of stocks. These are flows. So in a bathtub, you have a faucet, for instance, bringing water into the bathtub. And then you have a drain, draining water from the bathtub. And that's pretty much it. Because, okay, in a college or university, you have admissions, bringing students in. And then the students either graduate or leave with a degree, and they're leaving out the other end. And something similar happens with money, with deposits into a bank and withdrawals from the bank. And maybe there's many more avenues than just one for how a bank gets money. So you might have multiple faucets in the bathtub that is called a bank. You might have multiple drains, multiple ways that money can leave a bank. You might want to include, for instance, one that says theft from the bank, and that would be one drain from the bank. But the bottom line is that if you think about systems, you have just those two elements. And then, of course, you have things connecting them, things that connect them that say, okay, so how does the flow out from the bathtub depend upon how much water is in the bathtub, for instance? All right. You know what? I've been talking too much about bathtubs. Let's make a bathtub. So now everybody please grab a wrench, some soldering materials, a bathtub, a faucet. Now, let me show you what I'm going to use. So for this, I'm going to go back to screen sharing, and I'm going to give you links to all of these, so don't worry. I'm going to give you links to some of these to play with, so you can actually use them to answer some questions that I'm going to be asking you about. So let's start with the first one now. Okay, here we go. So this tool is called Insight Maker, okay? And all of you should now see on your screen something that says Insight Maker, create new insight, okay? So in a little bit, I'm going to give you a link to it, something I'm going to do with Insight Maker, but right now I'm going to make a bathtub. So this is the first one. This is intended for you to afterwards go make your own bathtub. I just want to show you the concepts and show you how making this, how making this can help you think about systems. So I see, why does this fit on the SAMR model? Oh, that's a very good question. You know what, let's forget about bathtubs and talk nothing about SAMR. Very briefly, it represents, in all seriousness, if you're thinking about SAMR at the upper levels, it's the type of tool that can be used, not but just per se, the existence of a tool does nothing for you, but it can be used to support the type of thinking at the upper levels of SAMR. And also, as it turns out, we won't get into that today, you can use SAMR as a scaffolding for some processes that you might want to use for thinking about Black Swans. So it's actually a good question. And yes, I know you do know, but I thought for people who were unfamiliar with SAMR, I'd just bring that up very briefly. And that's something you can look for more information on my website. But okay, so let's go ahead and make a bathtub. So to do that, first I'm going to select Create New Insight. Okay, and I'm going to clear the demo model because I don't need the demo model. I am now about to make a bathtub. Allow me to make a bathtub in just a few steps. First, we have here the primitives. And remember, I already told you about stocks and flows, so I can add a stock. Great. So here we go. I have my new stock, and I will call my stock bathtub. Now I have a bathtub. How fascinating. Okay, but now this bathtub is pretty much empty. If I click on the little corner here, you'll notice that it says initial value equation, bathtub 0. Well, yeah, it's a bathtub with no faucets, no drains. Nothing will ever happen to the bathtub. So let's add a faucet to this bathtub, shall we? Okay, so how do I go about adding a faucet to the bathtub? Well, there's a little arrow here at the center. If I click and drag on that arrow, I can drag it out here. And that created a flow. That was the other piece I told you about, except it's pointing in the wrong direction. It's pointing away from the bathtub. So that would be some drain in the bathtub. I don't want that, so I'll click on these two little arrows to reverse the direction. Aha, now it's a flow into the bathtub. And I'm going to call this flow a faucet. Great. And if I click on the faucet, the little sign here, it tells me that materials show out the source stock and into a sink stock at the rate determined by this equation. But right now it says 0. That means that no water is flowing through this faucet. It's completely closed. So I'm going to change it to a faucet that is filling up at the rate of about 1 liter every minute or so, something like that. So I'll just set it to 1. Okay, we could get into the units and so on, but for now, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to set it to 1. I'm going to set the checkbox. And to confirm what I just said, I'm going to go up to settings, and I'm going to set that to minutes rather than years. A bathtub that fills up at the rate of years is kind of a useless bathtub, unless you really, really don't take a bath very often. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and select that. And congratulations, I now have a bathtub that fills up. I'm going to run the simulation for 20 seconds. It's just the default. And to do that, I click on this little arrow that says simulations here at the top and run it. And lo and behold, the thrill, the chill, the excitement. In 20 minutes, my bathtub has filled up with 20 liters worth of water. Okay, I'll grant you, not the most thrilling thing yet, but give me a couple. We'll make it a little bit more exciting, okay? All right, so what can I do to change this? Let me close that out. Well, the first thing I can say is, you know what? That faucet is right now just turned on all the way. Can I actually change it so that my faucet is going to allow me to turn it on or off? And if I go here to the side, you notice it says here with the faucet selected, it says slider, show value slider, it says no. Let me change that to yes. And now I'm going to have a little slider, which I'm going to set from a minimum of 0, so completely closed, to 1. Let's assume that's the maximum flow rate I can do. Okay, so now I'm going to click somewhere else to accept this. And now, lo and behold, notice that my faucet can now go from 0 to 1. I can set it to any value in between. So let's go ahead and run it again at 1. Yep, got the same thing as before. Let's close that out. Let's run it at half the flow. So let's run that again. And now notice that in the same span of time, it only filled up about half the bathtub. So, okay, so it's a little more interesting as bathtubs go. I know. The fascination of bathtubs can sometimes be limited. We're going to move away from bathtubs in just a little bit. I just need to show you 2 more pieces. And believe it or not, with 2 more pieces, you can make all the complex models you could want from here. So here's the bathtub. Okay, so we have the faucet. Let's put a drain into this bathtub. So again, I'm just going to do the same thing I did before. Click and drag for a flow. This time it's okay that it's out. I'm going to baptize this flow drain. Okay, change it here. Okay, so I baptized drain. And as before, I can look at it by clicking on this little equal sign. And oh, dear Lord, yes, Brian, I'm sorry. My brain does tend to pun subconsciously, okay? So now I'm going to say, okay, so I've got material moving out of the source stock. I could set it to 1 or to some value, But let's use that slider trick I did before. So again, I'm going to show a value slider so I can open or close the drain more or less. I'm going to set it to a maximum of 1, minimum of 0. That's okay. Now I have 2 sliders. So let's see what happens as I play with this. So I'm going to open the faucet all the way, leave the drain completely closed, see what happens. Okay, that was my initial scenario. Okay, the bathtub fills, and in 20 seconds, it's filled to the same place it was before I put in the drain, because the drain isn't doing anything. Great. Let's open the drain halfway. And go run it again. And now notice what happens. 2 key things here. Number 1, okay, the bathtub only fills halfway. You can see why, right? The faucet is flowing in at 1, but the drain is draining about half of that in the same unit of time. Therefore, the bathtub fills up at about half the rate that if I had the faucet full on, drain also full off. So that's the first thing. And the second thing you should notice is now you should start trying to match this, because these are tools for thinking, against your intuition. Think about, well, was this what I was expecting or not? Some people sometimes expected a curve here instead of a straight line. That's interesting. That's important to keep in mind. You should start matching your intuition as to what this is going to look like against what it actually looks like. Let me close this out now and do one more example. What happens if I open both the faucet and drain? I'll give you a second just to think what that should look like. Okay, second this up. Let's run it. Yeah, nothing. It's flat because, sure, water is flowing in, but as soon as it's in, it's straight out the other end from the drain. So again, this began to give you a picture of, okay, I see how this can get interesting. One more thing, and we'll be ready then for me to turn this over to you to play with a little bit and experiment a little bit with an example. Okay, so I've been doing this with the drain, and I've been doing the drain with the slider. You know what? I'm going to make it a little more complicated though. Instead of having the drain be something I close or open manually, I'm going to make it something that has a little sensor or has a gravity adjust, whatever you want to use, that makes it proportional to how much water is in the bathtub. In other words, instead of being something that I close or open to a certain level and just leave it there, it's going to say, well, if the bathtub is empty, it's fully closed. And as the bathtub starts to fill, it starts to gradually open it more and more. Let's see what that looks like, shall we? Okay, so first things first, I need to get rid of that slider because I'm not going to use it anymore. So I'm going to set to no. And now, with that in hand, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make one more change. I'm going to go up here to where it says links. And links are going to allow me to connect things and to say, okay, this influences this other thing in a certain way. There's still stocks and flows, and as we're going to see one other thing, which are variables, which allow me to say, well, by how much is this influencing, okay? So, but the links say still, how much does this flow influence this stock or vice versa, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add one variable, and that variable is going to be something which I'm going to call something like drain rate. So I'll call it drain rate. Oops. There we go. And drain rate is going to be a value that allows me to say, well, this is going to be by how much the amount of water in the bathtub drains out. I'm going to give it a slider. Okay, so I'm going to give drain rate a slider. And the slider is going to go from 0 to 1, okay? So it's going to basically be a slider I can set and say, look, proportional to the amount of water in the bathtub, the drain rate is going to tell me how much water is draining. Okay, so what I need to do now, I'm almost complete. All I need to do now is with links selected, I need to now be able to tell it, okay, the drain rate is going to influence the drain. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to drag from here to drain, and notice it turns green and boom. Notice it's a dashed line, so it knows that's not a flow. That's something that says this influences that. So the drain rate influences the drain. The amount of water in the bathtub influences the drain. So I'm going to drag from here to here, went green. With shift, I can click and curve it a little bit so it's a little easier and prettier to see. There you go. So now I can see the two things that are influencing my drain. And if I go back to the drain, okay, right now it's just a number because that was just the last number I have. I'm going to delete that number. And I say I'm going to tell it that's equal to bathtub times drain rate, okay? So the more water in the bathtub, the faster it's going to drain. The more higher the drain rate, between 0 and 1, the faster it will drain too. Let's go ahead and do that, tell it okay. And now with all of this in hand, let's go ahead and run this. So first, let's run this example with the drain rate set to 0. Okay, the drain rate is graphed here at the bottom, just so you can see what it is. And you can see the bathtub fills as usual. But now let's say I change this and change the drain rate to about, I don't know, 0.5 or thereabouts. Watch what happens. Very interesting. What I now see is that my bathtub, instead of filling infinitely long until it overflows, then the room becomes the bathtub, then my house becomes the bathtub. Then if I live in an apartment building, the apartment building becomes the bathtub, and all of this is very, very distressing to my landlord. Instead of that, you'll notice that it converges to a value, so you can see that after a while, the inflow and the outflow balance each other. So it fills to about 2 liters, and then the drain manages the amount of water to match what is coming in, and it gets no fuller than that. And you can see there's a curve attached. At this point, congratulations, we have everything we need to model any system. And the interesting thing is that as we've been going along, some of these may have matched your intuition, some of these may not have matched your intuition, but the key thing is it gives you a way of building up a picture. So if you're thinking about students at the university, you can start building up a model. And Tom and I have in fact talked about what do models look like for, say, admissions. If you start thinking about, well, suppose I think that putting ads in the paper has a certain impact upon admissions. Suppose I think that student dropouts have an influence upon admissions because dropouts say to people, man, you don't want to go there, etc. And I put in a loop there. You can very quickly build up a model that starts giving you surprises. And guess what? This is where black swans come from. You're not going to predict, again, the particular black swan, but you start looking for the sort of things that are giving you hints that something's on the horizon, something's not quite right. And you also start to think about, well, what things might help me to, for instance, not have huge spikes, say, in a curve for admissions, because I probably don't want that. Or what things might help me, as many colleges and universities are doing right now, really deal with declining admissions, with a declining birth rate. These days, unfortunately, a declining number of students coming to the US with COVID-19 squelching people's desire to be in a classroom face-to-face with somebody else, etc. So these are things that allow you to start thinking about black swans. And then after the black swan event has occurred, if it has occurred and you have an institution that needed to respond to this event, it also starts to give you insight, because now you can retroactively explain the black swan, and you can say, there was this factor I never put in the model, and now you can start building out from there, okay? So I'm going to give you this toy now in just a second to play with, and let me show you what I'm going to give you to play with. I'm about to show you, sorry you have to leave, Brian, but I'm glad you were able to be here for the first part. Thank you for coming. Okay, so I'm about to give you a toy that's going to allow you to play with, let me switch now screens. Can you see right now on screen something that's a more complex model that says how rare is meeting PBG infected? I'm seeing people nodding, good. Okay, so this model is a model for a simple infection model that says, well, suppose that you have people that are infected with a virus. What do you have? Well, you have for stocks. Can they get the virus? Are they susceptible? Do they already have the virus, or do they no longer have the virus because they either got cured or died? And then you have these other elements connecting. They are flows, a flow that says you get the virus, another flow that says, do you heal? And then you have these links and variables that control the whole thing. So for instance, you'll notice that one of the things you might want to do is limit how many people you meet per day. That could be quarantine, or it could be extreme social distancing. So once you've met 5 people, you go home and you lock yourself up for the rest of the day, okay? How infectious it is, and how many days are you infectious for? So I'm just going to do a quick run because I'm actually going to give you a slightly more sophisticated model of like this one to play with. So I'm going to run it very quickly. And you'll notice what you have here, okay? You'll notice right now that you have these two nice curves, one that says, can they get PBG? Do they no longer have PBG? And you can look at these numbers and say, okay, that's what I have there. But suppose I increase the number of people I meet per day. My quarantine is less effective. Or people are ducking out and meeting with people at bars, something like that. Okay, I'll run this. Now you start to get more complex curves. Okay, where you see a first curve that says how many people are susceptible, a second curve that shows you how many people have PBG, and a third one that says, well, how many people do not have PBG currently because they either got cured or died. All right. This is yet a simple model because right now, I'm going to give you another model that's just a touch more complex. And this is a model by David Mayer. And it's a model that you can see right away the similarities to the previous model. And now it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to separate out whether people are cured or dead. And number two, it's also going to have a leak rate. In other words, from the quarantine and so on, etc. What's the leakage? How much exposure occurs in the whole thing? Okay, so is it a perfectly contained model, or is it a model with some leakage? It includes both these things here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to encourage you to play with this model. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to play with it. I'm going to give you a link to this. So in the chat space now, I'm going to go ahead, if I can get the chat here on screen. I'm going to paste in a link to this model. There you go. So if you go to this URL, you will be able to run the model. And I'm going to ask you a question. It's not a question that has a simple single answer or anything like that. I'm going to ask you all a question that's going to be important. If, for instance, you're an institution that is still thinking, do we reopen or do we not? If you're in a community that's thinking about should bars remain closed or open, well, what should you do? So my question is, how many people is it acceptable for you to meet in this case? Okay, you have how many contacts per day if you look at the side here. So, run it at the default, which is 7, okay? And if I run it at the default, I see that I have around 70,000 deaths, okay? If instead I run it at, let's say I decide it's acceptable for you to meet 20 people a day. Now I have 300,000 deaths. So what is it? What would you call an acceptable number? Why? You might decide, well, just lock everybody in, but you know that that's not going to happen. So what is an acceptable number? Why? I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene. And as you're playing with this, type into the chat space and say what you think with maybe a quick why. Now start thinking about this as you're going through it in Black Swan terms. How many contacts per day do you think triggered the sudden explosion that you saw? What type of scenarios then lend themselves to different types of contacts? And where should you be looking for? Where should your worries be? Should perhaps some people have been a little more worried about the subway? So Tom says the infection rate, yes, it's one way. This simplified model, it doesn't quite translate exactly to what R0 is, but it's how likely it is and mortality as a percentage of infected. That's correct, yes. So one of the things, but Tom's question brings up a couple of very good points. One of the things to keep in mind is some people say, well, but you're not throwing in this detail or that other bit or this other bit. The answer to that is, well, yeah, but you don't need that to think about this. If you want a good model for COVID-19, the IHME people have an amazing model that they've been using and refining and building up, but you don't need that to think about this. And in fact, getting too obsessed with the fine details can sometimes lead you astray, because you'll be too obsessed about, wait, it's influenza, it's H1N1, and that happened at the beginning of COVID-19. A lot of people were playing with models that were very specific, very detailed for H1N1, and lost sight of the big picture. And as I say, it would have been useful, for instance, to have this sort of general picture saying, well, maybe public transportation is going to be a big issue here. So maybe, do I know the exact number? No, but I know it's going to be more to one side, to the other. I can start playing with the idea and figuring out that maybe, for instance, instead of having regular public transportation, maybe I want to provide small vans that take people as essential workers to workplaces. Now, a lot of people said, wait, but they're still coming into contact with each other. And the answer is, well, okay, but there's a big difference. I think you'll start to find as you play with these parameters between 7 people and even 15 people. So sometimes a small difference can make a huge difference in outcomes. And this is the sort of thing that's involved in systems thinking. Again, it's what gives rise to one of the components that can give rise to Black Swan events, but it's also the type of thinking that you need to build into how do you respond to a Black Swan event. For those of you thinking about reopening, I know we have quite a few K-12 people in the audience, okay? I don't know how many of you here today are K-12, but you have under Can They Get, Thomas, where you have your question there. So again, you just click on the little corner, lower left-hand corner, as I've done in the demo, and you'll see that. So you're thinking about reopening a K-12 school. Some people say, well, it doesn't matter if you tier the classrooms, right? If you do decide to reopen. Yeah, I agree. Looking grim is definitely one of the things that you have to factor in. But one of the things is, once you understand the whys, you're absolutely right, it looks grim. But it also allows you to just say, not just generically looks grim, but it says, look, it looks grim because, and here's what's changing to make things look grim, right? So in K-12, for instance, I hear some people saying, well, it doesn't matter, we shouldn't worry about separating out the grades in what are, tranche or cohorts, where you just have the kids meeting with kids in each grade, because these kids have siblings, and those siblings are, of course, on different grades, so they're going to contact each other. But wait, you could model that. You can see the difference between one classroom where one school where everybody is pretty much mingling with everybody else, and another school where there's only one kid that has a couple of cross contacts. And again, see if that's acceptable or not. All right, so this is giving you a little bit of time to play with this. I'm sorry, it's a rather grim game, but nonetheless, I think you'll find that it's the type of thing you might want to do to think about this. I promised you 2 more toys. This is the one I want to spend the most time on because it's the one that you can get your hands dirtiest with right away. But let me talk about the other 2 because they're important conceptually to how you might think about this. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and switch my screen now. Okay. By the way, Tom, you can actually just change it by typing in. Again, I didn't want to get too much into the, and then pull down this menu. I strongly recommend try making the bathtub that I showed you earlier, and you'll see how to change all those values. Literally the bathtub, and trying a few feedback loops and so on. You'll see right away how to adjust all those things. So
yeah,
let me show you.
I saw that. It wouldn't let me change it, but the thing that is kind of interesting about the system and the question you posed is that none of the systems we're talking about are completely insulated from one another. I mean, you can't lock down a campus with 60,000 students on it completely. There's going to be a lot of leakage there. So, or elementary schools, and then go visit your grandmother and that sort of thing. So, I mean, the only firmly bounded group that is the one you have in there. It's the entire planet, as far as we know.
Correct. Right. So you always have to pick some boundaries, absolutely, and then you have to decide: is there leakage across boundaries? Will those boundaries matter to me? And again, Tom, what you're describing is exactly the type of thinking that is involved in Black Swan thinking, and exactly this type of think to the future so you can think to the past, this weird time travel thinking. So let me show you 2 more tools, and as I say, these I'll leave for you to play with. The second one gets to the question of agents, and let me call it up on screen right now. So share. Here we go. So now you should be seeing a lovely little picture of wolf, sheep on a screen. Is that what you're seeing? I can see a quick, yep, you're seeing, good, excellent. So if you're seeing that screen, this is now what happens when we get to the agent level of the simulation. Now, we were thinking so far of the big systems, but here's the thing. If you have a bathtub, all the water kind of goes together. You don't have this drop of water that has a mind of its own to go that way. And you don't have this other drop that goes here. So if you had a hot water and a cold water and one had red dye in it and one had blue dye in it, you know that mixing of layers happens at different rates. So you could say, okay, I'll just create one faucet for hot, one faucet for cold, create a mixing bathtub. You can do that, but at some point, you really need to start thinking in some scenarios about the individuals. So Tom, to your point, you're absolutely right. In a campus of 18,000 students, you are not going to tell every student to not go to the local bar, and not every student is going to obey you one way or the other, okay? So you need to have something that allows you to look at individuals. And even if you had all the individuals behaving more or less the same way, sometimes how individuals are grouped together in different ways, how they interact with each other as individuals rather than as a big class of things, a big stock, a big flow, as we were seeing before, can have an important impact. So I'm going to give you a second example here. And again, just so you have it, let me put this in the chat space. This is going to be the second example. So I'm going to put this right here. You can see I was very inspired with the tiny URL names. Okay, in case you're wondering where it comes, Learning Human 20 for the year, and then Swan for Black Swan, and then 1, 2, and 3 for the 3 examples. So this is an example of something that is an agent model. Here you're looking not at big flows and big stocks. You're looking at, in this particular case, sheep, wolves, etc., and grass. The grass is kind of a big stock of grass, but the sheep and the wolves are these individuals. Now, you can simulate sheep and wolves using systems, okay? You just have, a certain big pool of wolves and a big pool of sheep. But something interesting happens when you go to the individuals. I'm just going to set up things here, okay? This is a very simple programming language. It's called NetLogo. It's based upon Seymour Pappert's logo. And it's designed so a child could learn it and explore mathematical and simulation universes. You'll find that if you decide to explore it, it's very easy to learn. But if not, don't worry, because there's a ton of models. If I click here for a second on this little arrow at the top, there's tons and tons more you can get from the website. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on setup. Okay, so each time you'll notice I get a different set. It randomly puts together a set of sheep and wolves for me with a certain set of parameters. I have a certain initial number of sheep. I have a certain initial number of wolves. It takes a certain amount of time for grass to regrow after sheep have eaten it. And then we have how much energy do sheep gain from the grass, from food, their food is grass, how much energy wolves gain from eating sheep, and what's the reproduction rate for sheep and wolves. And then you have a chart, okay? So you have all of this. Let's go ahead and run by clicking on the go button. And look at what happens. Baba, black sheep, have you any wool? Okay. So the sheep are in red and there's tons of sheep, but that feeds all the wolves. Oh no, ouch, 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 ouch. No, wolves don't eat those last sheep. Oh, good, phew. Oh, but the wolf died out. Okay, end of story. Happy ending for the sheep. If I let this run, by the way, the sheep eventually take over the world because there's enough grass for them. But turn down the grass a little bit and you're going to find a rather sad ending for the sheep too. So I'm going to leave you here with a problem. I'm not going to have you do it right this minute. You now have the URL. I'm going to give you question number 2 to explore. Can you create a stable ecosystem with all 3 species? That a stable ecosystem doesn't mean you always have the same number of wolves, the same number of sheep, the same amount of grass. In fact, if you monitor, you're going to find that there's fluctuations and so on. But again, this goes to Black Swan thinking. Because sometimes we see a Black Swan event, and I've seen this happen with this. People will say, oh, Lord, no, look, Oh, Karina, fluctuations, congratulations. I'm glad to see somebody else has my same type of punning mind in mind, yes. So anyhow, so the bottom line is, I've seen this happen now with COVID, where people say, oh no, wait, that's a terrible problem. Let's make sure that everything we measure is held to this strict level. But here's the problem. The individuals involved, the scenarios, their interactions are individual to individual, rather than a big pool to another big pool. So what happens here then is that you wind up with a scenario where when you try to clamp everything, you kill everything. So you have to start developing this type of intuition. How do agents, those individuals, those molecules, those components interact with each other? This is another key component of Black Swans thinking, because again, sometimes it's the surprise from this. It's kind of, wait, it isn't the case that for all balances, you know, the wolf and the sheep will balance each other. Well, it looks that way in some cases if you took the big stock and flow approach to modeling, and you can find stock and flow models that show you a nice smooth oscillation. But in fact, when you go to the agent level, you find that's not always the case, and changing the size of populations, just a slight change, for instance, to how fast grass grows or how much energy sheep can get from grass. You can include a seasonal variation, for instance, with just a little bit more code to say, well, you get more energy from the grass in summer when it's nice and rich than in winter when it's kind of dry and nasty. And then you suddenly start to see other events driving this. Again, this is one of the things that you want to develop as this type of Black Swan thinking intuition. The last one I'm going to say the least about, but I'm just going to show it to you, is the question of networks. And networks, very briefly, let me share the third screen. So here it is. All right. And once again, let me give you the URL for this. So as you can guess, it's number 3. So let me go to the network here. The last item you need in terms of this kit is to say, okay, so we had the big stocks and flows, but then wait. Those are made up of little individuals, little agents. Both of these are useful. It's not that now throw away the stocks and flows, only think about agents. No, both of these give you valuable information. Stock and flows give you this kind of big picture feedback loops and so on. Agents start to show you how the individual interactions start to give you unexpected results. Well, the last thing is, but these individuals are not completely disconnected from each other. It doesn't matter whether it's humans or wolves or whatever. In many cases, there are network interactions. There's a very big difference between the model I just showed you, where all the wolves are hunting separately for sheep, and a model where maybe I'd say, well, what if I have an alpha and a pack? And there's a series of links that say, if the alpha smells sheep, it will be a more effective hunt, more likely to eat sheep at the end of the day, than if a random member of the pack smells sheep. So what you can do is you can use tools here, which are network analysis tools. In this case, it's social network analysis. This particular case I've given you here for you to explore is a case where this is an actual data set that was first created by Moreno and one of his students. And this data set was for women in a learning institution. And one of the things they were looking at is, well, who would like to have dinner with who else? So think of a round table, and you ask everybody, who would you like to have to your left, who would you like to have to your right, or an equivalent question like that. And from that, as you can see, I can input that data, and if anybody is curious, just message me and I'll show you it. It's very, very easy. I'm not going to do it right now because we're almost out of time. Okay, but you can see the connections. Okay, so you can see, for instance, that you have some people that have only a few connections. I'm right now pointing at one of them. Okay, and some people that have a ton of connections. So now I'm pointing at Marion with a ton of connections, and you can see it highlights all of it. So what I can do then is I can explore different ideas. So for instance, I could ask, okay, show me who has the most friends. And those would be what's called the in degree. How many people want to connect with me? And maybe that's what I want to do. So here I can see, for instance, that Marion has the largest in degree. Eve has the next one. Hilda as the next one, and so on. I can say, okay, so maybe that's a good start. But what if I want to do something different? What if I wanted to say, well, don't just show me who has the most friends. Show me who has the friends that are connected to the most friends. In other words, somebody might have a lot of friends, but none of the other people are friends with those people. So it's kind of a loner group over here. But suppose I want to know who has friends who in turn have a lot of friends. That is measured by a number called the eigenvector. And you're going to see that many of the same people show up, but many of them do not. And you can explore this. And you can start to ask questions along the lines of saying, well, who should I pick as a leader? Who should be in between two people? And you can also start to see the origins of Black Swan events. Because, for instance, yet another metric might be betweenness, and betweenness tells me which people are most frequently in between others. And notice that Marion still is the person most in between two others, but others are not. Well, what happens if Marion gets COVID-19? Suppose I had this great plan for my class to work in teams based around the team structure, and I said, Marion is my leader, but Marion is also the person through whom most messages go. And now if Marion gets COVID-19, nobody's talking with anybody else. Messages aren't getting through in the group. And I've got a problem. So this is, I'm leaving it for you to explore all the metrics here. If you go up here, have explanations so you can find out more about them. The question I'm going to ask you is, who would you pick to lead a team? Should you have more than one team? Who would you pick to communicate messages? What type of redundancy would you build in and why? So this is the third key component in this type of think about black swans that can come on scene and think about black swans after they've done their, and after they've entered the scene, if you will, in terms of how you might respond to them. The place at which you're saying those agents you were talking about before, how are they connected? And again, I want to emphasize, this isn't, oh, now you should do nothing but network analysis, don't do agent. No, you need to do all three levels of this. Each of these informs your thinking differently. Each of these gives you a different piece of the puzzle. And each of these, I hope you like the three toys I've shown you today, gives you something to explore, something to think with, something to help you think about how to deal with black swans once they've occurred. Not how to predict them, but how to be ready for a category of black swans, whatever they might be, as much as you can be ready, by doing what's sometimes called anti-fragile design. But we'll say that for another time. All right, I think I'm up in terms of my time right now. If there's any quick questions or comments that anybody would like to type in the chat space, by all means do so. I'll also be around the conference, so don't hesitate to contact me. And you've got all of these links. So any questions or comments? One more thing I'll put in here very quickly in the chat space is, and I'll give you my website with a link to my blog. There we go.
Well, and Ruben, this has been a fascinating initial discussion, but I believe you're continuing the conversation on Friday. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. So Friday is going to be a little bit more playful. Friday is going to be all about playing a game to help us think about how we might build an ideal anti-fragile university. So that's going to be in the game space. It's going to be, as I say, a little bit less serious than this was, a little bit less grim, hopefully a little bit more optimistic, but there's also going to be some seriousness involved in terms of saying, well, gee, how do we think differently about a college or university? So anybody who is interested, I welcome you all. And I'll have some virtual s'mores to pass around as we play.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruben. We don't have another breakout session immediately after this, though there will shortly be a pizza making workshop. So if you want to hang out and ask questions for a few more minutes, Ruben, that's up to you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to hang out. I just don't want to take up the space if somebody needs it. So, but yes, please, any questions, just then type in the chat space, or if you want to just use your voice, that's also fine, whatever works best for you.
Let's see, I see one question in the chat and then a couple people who have to run. To hedge against our ignorance, shouldn't there be a low probability of introducing connections that were not observed?
That's a very good question. One of the questions is always, am I guessing at a connection that may or may not be there? So the answer is basically, you can work it both ways. You can say, let me use all the observed connections. But then when you still get, the model says it behaves one way and then reality behaves a different one, that can actually be a good source for trying to figure out, is there a connection missing here that I did not know about? And one of my favorite examples is some of the recent work on ecosystems, where we're finding that restoring predators to an ecosystem makes riverbanks better. And saying, wait, what? How does having more wolves or whatever the apex predator is in a system have an impact on the health of the banks of a river or a pond or a lake? Well, it's a rather complex system interaction. And once you start looking for it and say, well, there's something missing here, what we found is that in the models, we start to see interactions that we didn't know were there between predator-prey species and what happens when you reintroduce a predator to a system. And suddenly we start having these aha moments. So that's a much nicer Black Swan than COVID-19. But it is exactly along the lines of the question of connections and what we know and what we don't know. Oh, and Laura, thank you, yes, for putting it. So that's the Alternative Universities game. So 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight on Friday.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Daniel, for that awesome question. And we can continue the conversation in chat or here for a couple minutes if anybody has any more questions.
So, Ruben, I have a question.
Please.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. No. Have you used this to model out the likely impact of opening colleges of X number of students in the fall in terms of trying to predict the equilibrium of the system going forward?
I've started, a very good question, Tom. I've started doing some work along those lines. One of the things I've been trying to do, and this actually goes to Daniel's question as well. One of the things I'm trying to do is to say, again, how simple a system can I use that will allow me to distinguish between different scenarios? So one of the key elements becomes, what's the environment surrounding that college or university, right? It's very different to look at a college in a small town, for instance, where the college is the primary employer, to a college in a small town where there's another big employer that tends to have people interacting heavily. So for instance, a big manufacturing plant or something that doesn't or can't observe social distancing, to having this happen in a big city. So the answer to your question is yes. I'm not yet at a point at which I would be comfortable saying, oh, I hear some general ideas, but it can be done, and I am doing it. And I'm looking specifically, for instance, at the small town scenarios, because we've seen multiple announcements by colleges in small towns that they're doing either a total reopening or a partial reopening under different conditions. And I think it's important to realize that sometimes people are saying, well, is the college taking the appropriate precautions? And my answer is always, well, that depends. What's the environment that they're interacting with look like? So if that college is interacting in a town with another major employer, that looks very different in my models from a town that doesn't have any other major employer. A college that's in a dry town looks very different from a college that's in a town with bars, which is obviously most of them, right? So in other words, what emerges very clearly, even as I don't want to say I can generalize it, but one thing I can say in general is any designs that are going to be both sustainable and responsible have to factor in not just the college, but also what the college town or the college city that college is in looks like. And those are very, very different things. It's not just a matter, some people say, well, what's the population density? That's a factor, all right. But it's, quite frankly, in some cases, not even the most important factor.
Yeah, you can't hermeneutically seal a college.
No, and I think any colleges that are making plans that involve students never ever visiting the bars in town are probably not the most realistic once.
Well, it's not just that; it's also the employees that live in town.
Correct.
You know, you still have to feed them. There's the cafeteria lady and things like that. And
that's absolutely correct. And for instance, that also crops up with schools, right? Because again, very different to say you've got the school and the parents are mostly in, very low density workplaces, as opposed to all the children are children of the people that work at the local factory, whatever it happens to be, with no social distancing. That's a very different environment for opening up a school, even if your baseline COVID-19 numbers don't look that different to begin with. Some people are just saying, what's your RT at this point in time? And saying that's an absolute number. I keep saying, no, sorry, you can't do that. Tell me what the backdrop looks like. Tell me what the other points of interaction look like. And as I say, I'm not claiming that the model allows you to predict exactly, 10 rather than 11 people will be infected, but it does allow you to see the overall picture and what you should be keeping in mind.
We'll have a vaccine in a few weeks. It'll be all good.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be, I think I'm going to try to not model the likelihood of a vaccine showing up in 2 weeks based upon the history of vaccine development. Something tells me there'll be a very, very grim model indeed. But
that's a true Black Swan event, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, putting a bookmark in it here, and we'll pick it up on Slack and again on Friday. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.